Trinity is at the heart of the Jornada del Muerto celebration. Yes, it stands for Dead Man's Journey. You drive past it on a two-lane road that runs right through the White Sands Missile Range, deep in the humming New Mexico desert. It was night, and the road was empty. The sky was black velvet, and the stars were as clear as they were where there was no civilization. Even a meteorite occasionally flew over the horizon, looking like a lone snowflake. It was just me, my trusty F-150, and the occasional armadillo. All that was missing was a smelly old brown dog named Buster, and it would have been a sad country music song. I was reminded of this a few days ago. It's funny how a simple decision can change your life. To cross the street or not to cross the street, to turn left or right, to scratch an itch or not to scratch an itch. We make hundreds of these choices every day, and sometimes they can kill you. I couldn't figure anything out. She just acted differently. There was too much detail in her work, like she were painting a picture. She was too attentive to the schedule, as if she was watching me and meticulously fulfilling her feminine duties. In this age, it's too easy to get to the truth. In fact, people would be less deceitful if they knew how far technology extends. So when that little devilish suspicion tickled my fancy, I simply downloaded the highly rated bluejacking tool. The only problem is that you may find out things you don't want to find out at all. Brenda was a great wife, smart, witty, gorgeous, and just a monster in the bedroom. How we met and married is irrelevant. Suffice it to say that for 14 years we lived a happy middle-class life in the northeast suburbs of Albuquerque. We were unemployed by choice, so we could afford the best of everything. A nice house, frequent traveling, and expensive restaurants. My wife worked as a public relations consultant for an international firm that made its fortune building paradises. Given New Mexico's sunny climate, trail building had long been a growth industry. The only problem was that people living in paradise might not want to build it. So Brenda held many meetings and networked with major financiers and politicians. Brenda's career was my version of Dante's 90th level of hell. I'm a nerd, you see, and nerds don't get out much. I do botany at Sandia National Laboratories, which is why we lived in Albuquerque. It's a high-paying, low-stress job because I'm very good at what I do. I work in counterintelligence technology. It's a profession that is based on lies and deception, just like politics. There's a lot of old-fashioned machismo in this job. But it's more like the machismo of Dr. Evil than the machismo of Conan. Of course, the devilishly clever will always defeat the stupid and foolish. You may be wondering how Brenda and I ended up as Beauty and the Geek. Like I said, the details of the affair are irrelevant. We hit it off because we are both smart, fun, and adventurous. She's dated a lot of jocks and good-looking guys. I'm not bad-looking and fairly well off, so I've had my share of hot women. The problem is that everyone we dated before we met bored us to tears. When you get married, you are only going to spend a significant amount of time with one person. Therefore, it is best to marry someone who excites you. Brenda and I had very different personalities, but we fit together like we were made for each other. But that doesn't mean we walked around joined at the hip. We had our own interests and special abilities, but our complementary qualities cemented our bond. Brenda's emotions made her an interesting partner. My wife was never bored or dreary, but sometimes her feelings got the best of her, and she relied on me to calm her down. And me? I'm too smart. Brenda brought me out of my reverie. We're both not very big. Brenda is 5'2" and I might be called 5'9", but we're both as healthy as can be. We both love the outdoors, and Albuquerque is the perfect place for that. We hiked, biked, and kayaked daily. People thought we were the perfect couple. I think it was my lack of height that gave Hondo the idea that Brenda would be easy prey. The neighbor was Richard Tadwell. He was a major in one of the training wings at Kirtland, and the role of the great American hero appealed to him. He had even adopted a call sign. No one knew where he got it since he wasn't a pilot. But he preferred to be called Hondo. Most of us just called him Tud, mostly because he hated being called that. Tud was muscular, half a foot taller than me and maybe 70 pounds heavier. Most of that weight was subcutaneous fat, whereas I didn't have an ounce of fat at 75, but the contrast in size made it seem like I was 3/4 taller than he was. And he didn't hide it. Every guy has been bullied. Most either accept it or fight it. But there are some fun alternatives. I've always been able to keep my mouth shut. So in bullying situations, I always responded with a clever remark that reached others but flew right over the target's head. The trick was to hit the guy in such a way that he wouldn't realize it had happened until he turned around and blew his head off. So when Hondo patronizingly called me Little Davy, I would shrug my shoulders, laugh self-consciously, and say, "You got the wrong guy, little Dickie." The look of confusion in Turd's eyes, I mean Tud's, at that rolling laughter was priceless. The snake snuck into my garden because people in our neighborhood like to have fun. There are many things that interest me, but not among them are gossip, innuendo, or frank judgments about the worldly adventures of distant acquaintances. But Brenda is good at it. I never could figure out if her group really enjoyed each other's company or if the parties were just a playing field on which they could reclaim territory. All I know is that there was too much drinking and close personal contact between the various players. I went to these horrible events because that's what good husbands do. However, because I cared the least about golf or the Albuquerque Isotopes win-loss record, I was always categorized as a supportive spouse, while insiders reveled in the pleasures of the herd. The typical pattern was a joyous arrival, followed by a machine gun crackle of small talk as they recounted the events of 6 long days of separation. Then, after the wheels of the overall mechanism had been greased by copious amounts of alcohol, the participants would get down to the real point of the evening: cozy, drunken conversations. These conversations usually involved overly familiar, questionable touches and melodramatic bursts of emotion on topics that might have seemed trivial if both participants had been of sound mind. Brenda lived for these things. She told me she loved people. Undoubtedly, she did. But she also loved playing the role of mother confessor to her daredevil girlfriends. Vampires need to suck blood, and Brenda seemed to have the same need to gossip. Nevertheless, I learned some pretty shocking things about the supposedly happily married residents of the neighborhood. At one such party, I caught my wife having an intimate conversation with Hondo Tadwell. It was amazing. Thad was hunched over and looking distraught, and Brenda was lovingly squeezing his hand in hers. I would have believed the pretense if it weren't for the fact that Hondo kept his eyes on Brenda's ravishing cleavage while he poured his heart out to her. I hated this guy for a whole host of reasons, besides the fake machista act. The scene playing out in front of me only added another count to the indictment. Turd was a tireless womanizer. To anyone who was foolish enough to ask, he told us it was his privilege as the alpha male in the herd. We all thought it was because he was an amoral asshole. We usually didn't pay attention to him unless he was hitting on your wife. Then the impulse was to get her out of his clutches, the sooner the better. So I said nonchalantly, though I was seething inside, "Come on, Brenda, it's late." She raised her head. Anger flashed across her face, and she said, "Can't you see we're discussing something important, Davy?" Now that was a different reaction. Turd realized he'd been caught, and he began to grieve nobly. He said, "No, Brenda, you've been a great help to me. You should go home to your husband." Then he patted her hand sadly, got up and wandered back into the seething mass of people, dragging the broken and defeated behind him. St. Brenda was distraught all the way home. It seems Turd's wife, whom he had loved since they graduated from Texas A&M University of the Arts, had begun to cheat on him, and he was devastated. They were the perfect couple. Turd was an obnoxious, narcissistic asshole, and Polly was an empty-headed, narcissistic bimbo who was once Miss Texas World. Turd nudged Brenda in a dark corner to ask her advice. When I peeked over their cozy sit-down, Brenda was helping Dickhead deal with grief. I didn't believe it for a minute. But Brenda loves heartwarming melodrama, and she wasn't happy that I had interrupted her little tete-a-tete. According to St. Brenda, Turd has uncovered dirt on Polly, and it's killing him. Any sane person would have immediately said that was nonsense. Turd was as elusive as Pepe Le Pew in his relentless pursuit of everything in a dress. So he had many of his own excursions off the reservation. But Brenda bought Turd's story. In the ensuing argument, Brenda tried to justify her willingness to listen to this smug goofball by telling me that there was actually a very sensitive person lurking underneath all that glitter. Of course, this remark opened up another front, and I said hotly, "And how do you know what may or may not be lurking beneath Tadwell's teenage exterior? Have you ever spent time in his treehouse?" Brenda had the nobility to make an embarrassed face. She replied, "Well, he stopped by a couple times to talk to you, but you were never there." This struck me to the core. It seemed Turd wasn't even trying to be subtle. I said, "Did it ever occur to you that you might be his target?" Brenda was genuinely puzzled. She said, "Why would he talk to me? After all, you are the one with the most governmental authority." He said he needed to discuss something about clearances. Now that's someone who doesn't understand anything. I said, "Look, Brenda, you're the prettiest woman on the block. All the guys on the block think so." Brenda looked at me with a typically feminine look that said she was pleased to hear that. But she didn't like hearing it from me because it created fertile ground for jealousy. I continued, "The camel was just trying to find out how far under the tent he could stick his fat lips. I hope you didn't invite him in." She looked concerned. She said, "I invited him in a few times. He asked if he could come in and wait for you, but he wouldn't stick around." I asked, sounding even more disgruntled, "How many is a few? And why wasn't he there when I came in?" Brenda looked as if something was beginning to get through to her. She replied, "Well, for the last month it's been 3 or 4 times a week in the afternoon. He stops by on his way home from Kirtland. But you were always at work. He waits for a while and we talk, but he has to go home or Polly will worry." I laughed out loud and said, "That's the biggest nonsense I've ever heard. Since when does Tudwell care about his wife's opinion?" Brenda looked at me indignantly and said, "He cares a great deal about his marriage. He tells me over and over how lucky we are to have each other. He wishes he had what we have. That's why I was so supportive when he told me about Polly's infidelity." I replied angrily, "He wants to have what I have and let that remain his wish only. Henceforth, tell Hondo to call me if he needs to talk. I don't want to catch him alone with you." Brenda said, getting very angry, "You have no right to tell me what to do. This isn't the Dark Ages." The discussion was going down a dark and dangerous path. So I said, "For the sake of compromise, if he shows up again, just call me at work. I guarantee I'll be there in less than 10 minutes." I knew that would chase the varmint away. Needless to say, we didn't have sex that night or in the weeks that followed. However, we loved each other, and the ice eventually melted. By the end of the month, we were both completely at peace with it. I thought, Santa Fe is a mile and a half above sea level, so even though it's hot in Albuquerque, it's always nice there. Also, Santa Fe has the most interesting art scene in the U.S. Brenda and I were fans of Georgia O'Keeffe, and her museum was selling some originals. The paintings were selling for anywhere from $1 million to $5 million, but I had my eye on a signed serigraph. It seemed like it could be had for only $3,000. So we went there to try our luck. Sometimes we camp out. But this was an expedition for fine art. So we took a different route and stayed at the Five Graces Hotel, which is relatively close to the museum. The hotel had a hacienda atmosphere with adobe walls and heavy Spanish furniture. The bed looked as if Ferdinand and Isabella had carved it in a monster workshop. Ornate was not the word to describe it. This was very apropos, as Brenda was finally back in good spirits. All month my wife had been distant. I attributed it to a fight over Turd. She thought I was mean and insensitive, and I thought she was an idiot. We made love more often than usual, but it wasn't the usual all-in-one extravaganza we were both used to. Obviously, the tender feelings were still there. Evening came as we'd finished our meal at a nearby restaurant. There is something special about a sunset on a warm evening in Santa Fe. The air is soft and the light has a unique red-golden hue. The sky was almost purple with bright incipient stars, and the crescent moon rising in the northeast made me want to howl. And Brenda's enthusiastic look told me that howling wouldn't hurt tonight. The next day, we went to the museum. Some men view their wives as trophies, living proof of their masculinity. I never viewed Brenda that way. She was my age and my partner. Her beauty was only one aspect of her contribution to our relationship. It was her spunky spirit and loving, warm heart that made her who she was. But now, I was caught in a Chinese finger trap. The more I berated my wife for Turd making a big deal out of it, the more she chided me for being mean and jealous. At the same time, I couldn't take Turd aside and tell him to stop making a fool of himself. I would have looked like a paranoid wimp. I refrained from taking any action, hoping she'd either come to her senses or Turd would screw things up on his own by going too far. I'm serious. You have to trust your wife. She's the only person in this cruel world you can rely on. And it's a very slippery slope if you start to have doubts. Maybe I'm being too cynical, But it seemed to me that Brenda's inherent faith in humanity was her Achilles heel. It made her a logical prey for any man cruel enough to take advantage of her innate tenderness. Of course, you'd have to be an amoral jerk to do that, but I knew a man who fit that description. Shakespeare was the first to write, "All the world's a stage, and one man plays many parts in his time." In short, what you think is reality is written and directed by you in your own head. Turd could have been a buffoon in his role as Captain America, the alpha dog in the pack, but alas, he didn't know that. In fact, he thought he was entitled to every right and privilege, and that's exactly how he behaved. The reality of his aggressive attempts to play Brenda off made him a threat because she couldn't see it. So I had to do something about it. And I guess there are some people who get away with cheating. But most couples get caught because cheating is such a complicated process. If you're cheating, you have to watch out for all the normal stuff, as well as a bunch of abnormal stuff. And normal people just can't account for all the nuances, so people who do things they shouldn't do will inevitably be exposed. Unexplained behavior always has a logical explanation. This truth applies to any aspect of life. For example, this is how scientists discovered the planet Neptune. They noticed that the orbit of Uranus was deviating from the norm, made calculations, and discovered that Neptune was pulling behind it. This is why the phenomenon of hidden influence is called the planetary body principle. The same concept applies to fraud. There is always some malevolent body behind a change in normal behavior. Watching Turd and Brenda socialize at parties, I could see him trying to pull her into his orbit. So I made the decision to cross the Rubicon. I used the 6 days before the next party to visit a darknet market and buy a simple man-in-the-middle package. I did it harmlessly. After all, if you start buying military-grade hacking tools on the deep web marketplace, you quickly become a person of great interest to agencies, both foreign and domestic. I dropped the bomb at the next barbecue. I sat with the rest of the geeks while Turd hung around looking like someone had shot his dog. Brenda watched him closely as I asked her not to. I scanned Turd's cell phone. Naturally, it was unlocked. He never bothered with such nonsense as protecting his phone from the likes of me. Of course, the only sure way to protect him from me would be to run him over with his car. But I digress. It took less than a minute to plant my favorite phrase in Turd's phone. He immediately texted Brenda a picture of an adorable kitten. The flying monkey was hidden in the steganography. She opened the photo and cast an adoring glance at Turd. The rootkit she had launched while doing so did the rest. Turd looked confused, which was to be expected since they both had no idea how much stealth crap I had just added to the background processes running on both of their devices. From now on, everything they did, photos, calls, and messages, would be under my control and logged into a cloud account I owned. I looked at my wife, who was calming Tadwell down. I said breathlessly, "Brenda, I barely knew you." It was a paradox of paradoxes. I wanted to know, I needed to know, but I didn't want to know. Healthy people don't dwell on such life-destroying events. It proved that I wasn't as cool and self-sufficient as I pretended to be. The world is a tough place, and a good marriage helps you deal with all that crap. It gives you a companion and a friend, regardless of threats or circumstances. So I really wanted to write off my suspicions as simple paranoia. I could live with a low opinion of myself, but what I could not bear was a discovery that would cost me an orderly and happy life. A figurative symbol of two people's loyalty is their willingness to limit intimacy with each other. I mean, seriously, you can't share your private with more than one person and maintain a special bond. And you can't trust someone who thinks you can. The problem is that humans are not naturally monogamous, so it takes a conscious act of will to remain faithful. Strong and moral people will keep their promises. People without honor will not. So in many ways, fidelity is a litmus test of a person's character. I had known Brenda for a long time and understood how important personal integrity was to her. So I couldn't imagine circumstances in which she would willingly sacrifice her precious sense of self-worth, especially for the sake of scratching an itch. Theoretically, of course. But if you're secretly trying to learn something, you shouldn't be surprised when you learn something new. But I was amazed. The fateful call came at 9:23 a.m. on the Monday morning after the party. It was Dickhead. Humble gratitude oozed from every pore. "Brenda, you're the only person who understands what I'm going through." I would kill myself if it weren't for your love. It's so hard for me to stay away from you, knowing what you and I have been through." My heart dropped. Brenda said with desperation in her voice. "I've already told you, Richard, I don't love you, I love my husband. I'm only doing this to help you adjust to your new life without Polly." What to do? My brain went into DEFCON 1 mode. "Weapons at the ready," Turd said with regret in his voice. "I know that, but it's the only thing keeping me afloat. Perhaps we will meet in the near future. I really need your special comfort," Brenda said, her voice softening. "I understand. I would feel the same way if I found out Davy was having an affair with her. We can meet one last time. But you're going to have to go through this without my help. I don't want to lose my marriage because you can't handle it." Seriously, has this woman completely lost her mind? The rest of the conversation passed in preparations. Tudwell was going to be in Holloman on Air Force business and wanted Brenda to meet him in Alamogordo the following Wednesday. That was over 200 miles away. So the distance to meet had to be a safe distance, Brenda wondered. But Turd's pathetic whining eventually overcame her resistance. Brenda's company owns a fleet of small two-seat helicopters. They use them to circle their territory. To do real estate in New Mexico, you had to do it almost all the time since the desert areas aren't that close together. So Brenda had a private helicopter pilot's license and was used to flying to different places. It was one of her most interesting quirks. She could easily fly to Alamogordo and back in one workday. You might think my wife is either a complete idiot or a whore. No one with an IQ above room temperature would buy Turd's bullshit. But this man has been stalking her for God knows how long to intimidate her. And by all accounts, he's succeeded. Brenda was innately kind, warm-hearted, and sentimental. She loved puppies and kittens and cried at every heartwarming movie. Unfortunately, she was also willing to fool herself into believing that people meant exactly what they said. The call ended with Brenda saying, "I'll meet you at the usual place, but this is the last time." Turd said with tears in his voice, "Yes, I know, and thank you." My initial reaction was a confused, blank, "Oh shit." Look, the kind that Wile E. Coyote always gets when he discovers he's run off a cliff. And, just like the coyote, it was immediately followed by a long fall, smearing his guts all over the desert landscape. How could Brenda have been so stupid? Stroke, heart attack, take your pick. You're walking down the street not caring about anything. And then your life changes. All your former certainties evaporate and are replaced by a terrible and all-consuming feeling of desolation and hopelessness. That's exactly what happened to me. The first explosion of anger was directed at myself. I had underestimated Turd. He was such a caricature of a human being. I had assumed that everyone could see right through him. But of course I wasn't there for him during the long hours he spent at our kitchen table painting his wife a different picture. Turd must have convinced Brenda that he was sensitive and sincere. Underneath all that nonsense lurked a genuinely good man. In fact, he may have used what Brenda knew of his bastard character as a form of mental jujitsu to convince her that his obnoxious behavior was meant to protect his gentle self from the hardships of a cold, cruel world. For Brenda, this would be a godsend. Since Turd's social development had not progressed beyond the age of 14, it probably never occurred to him that there might be consequences. I don't have physical attributes, but I do have certain skills. And I was planning to shit on Richard Tadwell from a very great height. It was Monday. I had business at Sandia, but the rage burning in my heart demanded satisfaction. I didn't know the whole story, yet. What's more, I wasn't even sure anything had happened at all. My little pet hadn't given out any new information since Monday morning. Nevertheless, I prepared for the worst. I was going to stay in Alamogordo until the last minute because I had to officially finalize things with Brenda. Then I could agonize in peace. Of course, my decision to end the relationship on Wednesday meant that I would have to spend 2 nights with a woman who was trying her best to appear to adore me. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. It simply means that people combine contradictory facts into a convenient truth. Essentially, a person splits themselves into 2 conflicting identities. Tonight, I dealt with the real Brenda, the faithful and loyal one. The short-lived version of cheating only appeared when I wasn't around. I tried to discern a single sign that my wife was considering betrayal. All I saw was love and loyalty. Her eyes shone with devotion when we dined at La Crêpe Michel, a small establishment we favored because of the vegetarian dishes. She really believed her lies. It made me wonder if she had lost her mind. Perhaps the stress of cheating turns a person into a psychopath, especially if they are a decent person at heart. Even so, temporary insanity can be a defense against murder. But that doesn't apply to adultery. I could have begged Brenda not to go, told her I knew the whole story. But nothing about our situation would change. She was past the point of no return. So my goal was retribution, not reconciliation. Tudwell was to be punished severely, and this was to be a prime example of hacking. First, I needed pictures. The more candid, the better. Then I was going to spread the word about Turd's sordid life to everyone on his contact list. His wife, his mom, his pastor, all the way up to the commander and possibly the Secretary of the Air Force. The beauty of it all was that I didn't leave fingerprints. After all, the evidence would be sent from Turd's own cell phone. He would know it was me. And everyone else would be wondering why the guy decided to end his career and personal life. Having access to a man's fate in one hand is intoxicating. And then, I'd kick his ass. I was going to post his information, name, date of birth, social security number, all of it on every bulletin board in the dark web. By the end of the day, Turd would have 150 new mortgages and a couple thousand new Visa cards. In addition, he'll want to be questioned by Interpol and the FBI. After the fruits of this atrocity had fallen to the ground, I planned to send the dude a note, no doubt to his new address under the bridge abutment. Really, Thud, don't thank me. It was my pleasure. Revenge really is best served cold. The trip takes 4 hours by car, so I didn't get to Alamogordo until closer to 2 p.m. Time-wise, it's more like an hour and a half at 120 miles per hour. Brenda's Denali H3 was parked in the desert behind the Quality Inn and Suites on White Sands Boulevard. It was the yellow and white car she particularly likes to fly. Since Brenda had already arrived, I figured I could start chopping nuts right away. It was a regular chain hotel serving Holloman Air Force Base. I walked into the lobby in a business suit. The guy behind the counter didn't look up. I sat down in one of the chairs in the lobby and used my iPad. All it took was a simple fake receptionist. The two men were in room 217. Tadwell had booked it in his name. I thought, what an arrogant fool. I don't like messy confrontations. They accomplish nothing and get out of hand. My profession gives me access to cool military toys. That's why I brought the Aardvark with me. It's one of those technological marvels that came out of Afghanistan. Our guys want to know the situation before they break in the door. That's why they use Aardvark. It gave me everything I needed to take down Tudwell. I sipped a decent hazelnut coffee while I used the Filmmaker Pro program to create a 60-second clip of Turd's greatest hits. I intentionally made it short. Some servers have size filters, and I wanted the whole world to witness Tudwell's betrayal. I made it clear that Turd, in his cinematic debut, was an extremely unfaithful husband. As soon as I got home, I planned to throw Tudwell to the piranhas in the dark web. But to do that, I needed the anonymity of the Tor browser. No one in their right mind would dare enter that scary place without a cover. At exactly 3 o'clock, the elevator door opened and out stepped Richard Tudwell. He didn't pay any attention to me. Why should he? I wasn't supposed to be there. Fortunately for my sanity, his phone rang just as he started to cross the lobby. He cheerfully answered the call. There was a long pause while someone spoke. Then bewilderment appeared on Turda's face and soon horror. For a few seconds he argued. Then the interlocutor abruptly hung up. Turda ran to his car in a panic and sped back down White Sands Boulevard. Apparently, his wife or supervisor had just overlooked his little indiscretion. I was savoring the beginning and end of Turda's overly titled life when the elevator buzzed again and my wife stepped out of it. She looked both gorgeous and pensive at the same time. It was clear that she was troubled at heart. Lowering her eyes, she headed toward the back of the motel where her helicopter was parked. It was an adulterer's walk of shame. Then she felt someone's presence in front of her. She stopped and looked up, irritation red in her eyes. The look turned to one of incomprehension and then it hit her. It's called vasovagal syncope. It's caused by shock. The more common term is fainting. First, her eyes reflected pure amazement. Then they rolled back into her head. I picked her up in my arms and dragged her graceful little body to the nearest couch in the lobby. The last thing I wanted to do was make a scene. Luckily, the guy behind the counter had already disappeared. I sat her down there, still supporting her with my arm. She came to her senses almost instantly, looking confused, and then noticed who she was leaning on. Her sigh was loud enough to be heard by anyone in the hall. Fortunately, there was no one else there but us. I said as gently as possible, "I don't want you to explain anything. All I want to do is make the necessary final preparations." Brenda's face crumbled. She said in a voice full of sadness, "Oh my God, Davy, this wasn't supposed to happen." I thought, "What were you thinking, Sherlock?" But I replied, "You know the business I'm in." She grabbed me by the shoulders in a panic and said, "You have to let me explain. Things are not what they seem." I thought, "They never seem to have fresh or original lines." I said, "That's exactly what it looks like, my dear. Would you like a replica?" I clicked the icon on my iPad. Tears appeared on her face. She dropped her head in her arms and sobbed uncontrollably, repeating over and over, "You weren't supposed to know." We still had the lobby to ourselves, and I wanted to avoid a tantrum. So I pointed to the ladies' room and said, "Why don't you go in there and pull yourself together, and we'll talk at home tonight? I have a long way to go." She nodded, misery written on her beautiful face. She said pitifully, "I love you, Davy, only you." I stood up, looked at her sitting on the couch, and said quite sincerely and honestly, "I love you too, Brenda. That's why this is so hard. It's getting late now. We'll talk at home." I turned on my heels and walked as calmly as possible toward the parking lot. The sounds of a woman crying rang in my ears. I was starting to feel wobbly myself, so I stopped at the first establishment that led north. I needed a drink. The waitress, who looked like an exhibit from a museum of tattoos and piercings, brought me a beer. The beer was simply necessary. I began to feel the effects of the shock, nausea, and chills. I realized that I needed to get back in the truck quickly or I wouldn't make it home. As I drove, I was happily contemplating the storm of shit I had unleashed on Tadwell. The look of absolute horror on his face was priceless, and the best part was that he hadn't seen anything yet. The real pain would come when Dark Web was done with him. Like I said, there were far better ways to get revenge than ending up in prison, like destroying the bastard for life. However, there was also the pathetic little bird whose soul I had just crushed. I could see it in her eyes. She knew her worth. It wasn't about misguided trust or my ego. That's a simplistic view of cheating. The exclusive bond was broken and every aspect of our special bond was gone. We could never say, "It's just you and me forever." The ghost of Richard Turd Tadwell will always stand between us and say, "But I was there too." We all have our weaknesses, every one of us. Some lucky people manage to get through life without being taken advantage of. But more often than not, your personal weaknesses become your undoing. Worse, there is always collateral damage. Like when the person you supposedly care about most turns out to be dragged into the abyss with you. That was the reality we both faced now. As for me, I was experiencing that feeling of devastation that comes when you realize you're in the shit without a paddle. I had to take proactive steps to deal with Brenda's infidelity. But what was I supposed to do? Divorce her? Bury her in the backyard? Live like a cuckold? I don't like cuckolds or murderers. So door number one seemed like the only viable option. We'd talk. But Brenda was a stranger to me now. I had no idea what could have motivated her to do such a hurtful thing. It was completely out of character for the woman I thought I knew. I assumed we had a shared vision for our future. Obviously, that was not the case. There would be no more happy moments, no more enjoyment of the little things in life, no more growing old together. It would be an agonizing parting for both of us. We were just two strangers, alone in a strange land. It was already completely dark when I drove through the Mockingbird Mountains and into the deserted area leading to State Road 525. The song "When Somebody Knows You That Well" by Blake Shelton was playing on Sirius XM. There was a sense of sad irony in the lyrics of the song. I was driving through the bleak landscape of the Sonoran Desert. It was hard to believe that in this barren wasteland, the future of humanity was being laid down. Our modern era began at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945. It was at that moment that the concept of a nuclear device blossomed on the desert sand in front of me. Its code name was Trinity. Robert Oppenheimer had coined it, ostensibly as a reference to the poetry of John Donne. But American physicist Ken Bainbridge said it best. Now we're all sons of bitches. Splitting the atom has changed every aspect of human existence. The scientists who did it had no idea if their little gadget would work and what would happen when they pressed the button. So they wanted to conduct the test as far away from civilization as possible. The U.S. Air Force Alamo Gordo bombing and firing range was the perfect place to do it. It was in the middle of 100 miles of forbidding wasteland full of nothing but lizards and snakes. There was only one structure within a 20-mile radius, the building where the bomb was assembled. When they finished, they hoisted their creation onto a 100-foot steel tower, which stood on 4 pillars 20 feet into the desert. Afterward, the world witnessed the dawn of the atomic age. The explosion turned sand into a new radioactive material called trinitite, and Oppenheimer, who was a bit of a bard, said, "I have now become death, the destroyer of worlds." I was approaching the access road leading to the Trinity facility itself. The landscape was decorated with a strange silvery light that radiated from the night sky with trillions of stars and a full moon. The road was on my right and clearly visible. Headlights swept over a historical marker and a small figure appeared at the intersection, looking straight at me. It was the strangest, most startling vision imaginable. I braked and came to a stop. An alien-looking creature appeared in the cone of my headlights. It was a young woman of unearthly beauty, small but unusually graceful. I realized she was unusually slender because she was wearing a tight black suit that encased her from neck to boots. Her skin was a perfect alabaster color, and her lovely round face was elfin, with huge, wide-set green eyes and short black hair. To think of Tinkerbell in a cat costume. The costume had some kind of strange insignia over her left breast, and on her right arm she wore a device similar to the monitors worn by U-2 airplane pilots. I knew there were several out-of-state airfields in this part of the woods, including Stallion AFB, which I was to pass by. So forgive me if I assumed it was a spy plane. I jumped out of the truck. She stood on a pair of long, slender legs, one hip off to the side, and looked at me puzzled. It was an odd reaction for someone who had just parachuted down from 65,000 feet. I asked worriedly, "Are you all right, ma'am? Can I take you somewhere where you can contact your people?" She replied in a strangely melodic voice, "No, thank you. I was just getting my bearings. It's confusing here." It was a strange answer, like she was refusing to drive home from work. I said, "There's nothing for miles around, ma'am. Let me at least drive you to a place where you can call." "How did you get here?" She looked at me like I was an idiot and replied, "Through a portal, of course. Why?" Things got even weirder from there. I tried to speak in a steady voice so as not to upset the crazy woman. "And where is that portal, ma'am?" She waved her hand vaguely toward the northeast and replied, "Over there. It's a long walk." She gestured to the black obelisk marking Ground Zero, 4 miles away. I said, still trying to make conversation. "Just to be clear, you got here through a portal that transported you from another place, yes? And where exactly is that other place?" She made a sound like a combination of a cough and a sigh and looked at me expectantly. Then she added, "I had to leave. It wasn't safe there." So, to summarize, this gorgeous little creature was running from an undefined problem that happened somewhere mysterious and ended up in the middle of the night in the Sonoran Desert. There was a shadow portal here which she treated like a subway stop. Perhaps you can understand my bewilderment. Add to that my recent experience with marital infidelity, and you can probably imagine the level of stress that led me to have a stroke. Still, I couldn't just leave her there. I said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's not safe here either, ma'am. Why don't you get in the truck and I'll take you to a place where you can get help?" Whether it would be psychological help or just roadside assistance was debatable. She looked hesitant. I said, "Look, I'm not going to take you somewhere you don't want to go." I could see that was exactly what she was thinking. There was an ominous vibe coming from this woman about the cosplay/intergalactic refugee meme. I added, continuing to sound reasonable, "Since the 18th century, this area has been called Death's Journey. There are only snakes and predators around us, and you won't last long alone." At that moment, a coyote nearby let out a dramatic howl. My little psycho flinched and said pleadingly, "You're not going to hurt me." I replied, "Why would you think that?" Of course, only a few microns of mylar separated her from full nudity, and she really did have the most exquisite body imaginable in Playboy or beyond. so I guess I could understand her concern. I added, "Look, I have my own problems. If you get in the truck, I'll tell you an entertaining story." My new acquaintance may have just come from the planet of coughs and sighs, but she was clearly interested in what I had just told her, and the coyote added a convincing threat. So she hesitantly walked over to the passenger side of the 150, got in, and moved close to the door. For a while, we drove in silence. Then she asked, "So what's the story?" I laughed and replied, "The events of my miserable life don't interest you. I just told you this to make you behave sensibly. People die here, you know." She looked worried. She had such a perfectly proportioned face and such delicate features that she seemed like a porcelain angel against her warm alabaster skin. I said sympathetically, "Where are your men? Where are you going? Who can I call?" She still looked confused. Finally, she said pitifully, "I don't know anyone on this planet. It's just the place where the portal formed when I jumped through the event horizon." "Okay, time to mess with the crazy woman." I said kindly, "So what made you jump? Why did you do it?" It must have been the first time she had thought about the reason since it happened. She looked at me in horror and replied, "It was horrible. The growling, 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 growling was killing everyone. It was my only way out." I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "So you were fleeing from something I can't pronounce. Who are they?" She replied, "They are intergalactic predators and my planet is their new feeding ground. I was lucky enough to be on shift at the transporter center when they showed up." You could tell by her tone that everyone knew about the growls and hiccups. She then paused and seemed to be thinking about something. She added soothingly, "Don't worry, I closed the portal when I jumped. They won't be able to get in here now." Well, at least this conversation was more interesting than country music. I said, "Okay, let's assume you are who you say you are. Then why do you look human? And why can we communicate in English except for a few words?" She cheerfully replied, "English? Is that the name of your language?" Then she added, "I'm speaking directly to your mind. But some of the things we discuss have no concepts that can be translated." So my little weirdo claimed to have telepathic powers. She continued, "All life forms of our type came from the same basic structure. It's the most efficient structure in nature. So of course we are alike." I laughed and said, "You have an answer for everything, don't you?" She smiled sweetly and replied, "So why are you so sad?" This shocked me. I replied, "How do you know I'm sad?" It must have been my body language. She added in a voice full of innocent curiosity, "Is it because your friend was just brought in by another man?" I braked, stopping the truck right in the middle of the road, and stared at her in amazement. I asked worriedly, "How do you know that? Who are you?" She replied, "My name is Stella, and as I said, I come from the coughing sigh in the Perseus arm of our galaxy. Your sun is in the outer arm, so we're practically neighbors." She smiled flirtatiously at me, then sat there looking at me as if she'd just made a joke. "Don't bother telling me." Of course, I knew she was delusional. But to play a joke on her, I said, "If you're from an advanced alien race, why are you here in the middle of the howling desert? One would think your ancestors would have set up an arrival point in a more convenient and civilized place." She said, as if lecturing a child, "The builders set up a portal in a place where they find irrefutable evidence that the culture has evolved enough to merit study." I said, "So the explosion of the first atomic bomb was like a signal flare for your people." Gah! Now I was beginning to sound like her. She nodded and replied, "Yes, there are billions of civilizations in our galaxy, but only the advanced ones are of interest." She said it as if everyone should know that. Crazy continued, "The builders actually prefer a remote access point. It allows them to come and go in secret. We have been scouting your planet for over 70 years. We even lost one of our first expeditions not far from here." She must have been referring to Roswell. The woman was undoubtedly suffering from some sort of psychosis. Seriously, she really thought she was an alien, so I couldn't just drop her off at the Albuquerque bus station. After all, it would be wrong to abandon such a crazy woman. The problem was that I was rushing home to negotiate the end of my marriage, and I knew the conversation would be heated if I showed up with that delicious morsel in tow. It would be like pouring a gallon of gasoline on a raging fire. So no pressure. Stella said sympathetically, "You can just leave me alone if I'm in the way of you meeting your buddy." I didn't hit the brakes. I was used to her reading my facial expressions like she was reading my mind. Still, I realized I'd been betrayed. My new friend was clearly a decent person. I said, I don't know your story, but I can't just throw you away. I have to help you. A beauty like her wouldn't last 2 minutes on the dirty streets of Albuquerque. I said, I don't know how you know that. But you're right. I just saw my wife with another man, and in my culture that is the grossest form of betrayal. I'm going home now to discuss the terms of our separation. Culture? I had to watch myself or she would drag me into her delusion. Stargirl Stella was very convincing. She nodded and said, yes, that's the way it is in most family cultures. It guarantees the origin of the offspring. In my world, it doesn't matter since all children are raised by the central gnome. I assumed that was her untranslatable word for government. She added seriously, of course, couples can choose to have an exclusive union. It's very romantic. But the grunting hiccup they implant in themselves during the initiation ceremony kills them if they engage in extramarital relations after being bound. The grunting hiccup was obviously a technology. Maybe we should get one of those, too. It would certainly make couples take fidelity more seriously. I smiled at the thought and said, we haven't gotten to that point yet, but our technology is good enough that you can always tell when a person has gone astray. That's how I caught my wife. And the guy who seduced her will definitely regret dying when I ruin his life. Stella said, reflecting, I never had any desire to tie myself down in marriage. It's too sad to be tied to one man. On the other hand, sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be so devoted to a man. I replied, it's beautiful and scary. The intimacy that two people share far outweighs the lack of diversity in partners. Damn, I forgot. Our exclusivity was already past tense. I tried to remain calm. After all, I was talking to a crazy person, but I couldn't drown out the ranting in my head. It was the same archetypal duality that infidelity breeds. I loved Brenda and hated her, and the more I thought about it, the more I was convinced that killing Tadwell wasn't such a bad idea. Stella said encouragingly, killing another man is not the answer. You've already made things much worse for him by making him look like a predator. You need to talk to your friend and find out why she did what she did. Not knowing will prevent you from moving on. Okay, this was getting creepy. I said, my head is a mess right now. I don't know how you're doing it, but you're right. I want Tadwell to live a long and miserable life, but Brenda is a different matter. I tried to explain. You can't just turn off your feelings for someone who was such an important part of your life. My wife and I had an exceptional bond. It was something alive, and now she's dead. I feel that. So my feelings of alienation are not a matter of ego or jealousy. It's a permanent psychological block. I've lost all faith in her. My gorgeous celebrity girlfriend sympathetically added, yes, I feel that. Do you feel the end of other people's hopes and dreams? I obediently said, my rational mind tells me that I should forgive and forget. But my heart won't let me do that. I would make up with Brenda in a heartbeat if everything happened by accident. But I know she met him more than once. So it was a planned and deliberate betrayal. Now I have a long and agonizing process of unraveling our lives. It helped that I said it out loud, albeit to an insane person. It also reminded me that a supposed alien from the planet Kophsai was sitting next to me. I asked, hoping to elicit the truth from her, honestly, you can't contact anyone? She pathetically replied, not within a radius of 6,000 or 7,000 light years, and they've probably been eaten by now. She turned her sweet, tear-stained face to me and said pitifully, you are my only hope. I must put myself in your hands. Great. I just adopted a gorgeous stray kitten and at the same time got rid of a cheating wife. Why am I? Worse, this woman looked like the cover girl of Sports Illustrated. I was sure her presence wouldn't go to waste in my divorce proceedings with Brenda. But what else could I do? I planned my first steps as I pulled off the I-25 freeway and headed north. I knew I needed to find a place to stay for the night. After all, I couldn't live with my soon-to-be ex-wife. So I decided that I would drop off my star girlfriend first and drive to the house myself. The 15-story monolith of the Marriott Albuquerque Hotel was in close proximity to where I lived. It was overly grand and expensive for my taste, but I wanted to park my car in an anonymous place, and for anonymity there's nothing like a big hotel with a conference room. I'll go back and try to decide what to do with Stella once I've worked out the ground rules with Brenda and gathered a few essentials. I asked her to stay in the car while I checked us in. She asked, "Why?" I didn't bother to explain that we would likely end up in the pages of the Albuquerque Journal if I walked her through the lobby. She was so spectacular, especially in her tight outfit. So I told her, "You never know. The authorities may be looking for aliens." A look of absolute horror appeared on her face, and she said anxiously, "I'll wait. I saw what they did to the people on the ship that crashed." Apparently, she had a vision of being dissected like a lab rat. Check-in took a little while because I had to look for a room with 2 twin beds. I walked out the back door and escorted Stella up the stairs to our room. The sight of her incredible, almost naked buns climbing 14 stories in a catsuit left me confused. As soon as we entered the room, she began strutting around the room as if she had never seen such luxury. I asked her, "Aren't there places like this on your planet?" I had already given up trying to be rational with her. She replied, "No, my planet is the same size as yours, but we have 100 times the population. That's why we live like rodents in small rooms in huge towers, each with only the bare essentials." I thought she had just described Manhattan, but I said, "Try to relax. It's going to take some time." I showed her how to work the TV. She acted like she'd never seen anything so ancient, but she immediately fixated on the cosmetics commercials. I closed the door while she stared passionately into the TV and took the elevator down to the truck. It was nearing midnight. It had been a long day, and tomorrow, with a good night's sleep, I would begin the agonizing process of figuring out why Brenda had betrayed me. But I needed to finish my preliminary preparations. When I walked in, my wife was lying on the couch in the living room. She was wearing an old, tattered robe. She looked devastated and beautiful. My appearance woke her up. She stirred, moved her gorgeous bare legs to sit up, and timidly said, "Hi, you're home at last." I replied softly and lovingly, "Because you can't just call off 14 years of happy marriage. Yes, I need to pick up some things and make arrangements to see you tomorrow. I also wanted to make sure you were okay." She got up and ran over to me. She put her head on my chest, crying hard, and said, "Oh my God, Davy, I'm so sorry. I didn't expect this to happen. I'm such a fool." I put my arms around her and stroked her back while she cried. I said, perhaps too harshly, "Well, it happened. Now we both need to decide how to deal with the aftermath. We can start that process in the morning. But I'm so exhausted emotionally that I don't want to do anything but sleep right now." She leaned back in my arms, threw me a sizzling look, and said, "Let's go to bed. I want to start making it up to you." I smiled weakly and said, "That's not going to happen, Brenda. I just need to get a few of my things and I'll be out of here. We can talk later." The next 15 minutes were agonizing. My wife, the woman I'd loved for almost a third of my life, followed me around, crying pitifully and begging me to stay while I gathered my clothes, toiletries, and laptop. Finally, I stopped, turned to her, and said angrily, "Listen, what did you expect? Did you really think I was going to agree to you having fun with this jerk as payment for me staying married to you?" I had never spoken to her like that before. This was her first hint that the consequences could be fatal. She began to whimper. "It was only for a couple weeks. You weren't supposed to find out. I was so careful." This confirmed my suspicions. It was intentional. My heart exploded like the Death Star. I said, maybe a little ruthlessly, "You play, you pay. Now we've both lost. I need to get out of here or I'll say something I'll regret later." I closed my bag, grabbed my laptop, and walked to the truck. Brenda followed me the whole way, wailing, "Don't go. Please don't go. I'll do anything." It was heartbreaking. I'm a nerd. So, of course, I had to analyze everything. First, it was obvious that Brenda didn't have a plan B. She expected to have a little fun and then go back to her life as my loving wife without my husband finding out anything. Second, whatever her motives were, she always knew she was doing the wrong thing. And finally, her motives were more complex than simply helping Turd in a time of need. My wife was a nurturer, right down to the tips of her nails covered in colored nail polish. That certainly explained her strange fascination with Dick Bright rehab. But it did not explain why she was cheating on me. Of course, Brenda had to believe that the situation was temporary, and since neither husband was hurt during the fulfillment of her fantasy, her actions were appropriate, at least in her own mind. I didn't like it, and I didn't sympathize with her. But I did understand her. After all, Richard Turd Tadwell was the one who needed to be held accountable. Turd probably saw it as part of the game he'd been playing throughout his protracted adolescence. Tough guys were getting hot chicks, so naturally Turd wanted my wife. Of course, I blame Brenda too, but it was Tadwell's scheming that had led her to the dark side, so I wasn't going to set the hellhounds of the dark net on Brenda like I was going to do with Tadwell. Nevertheless, the marriage was consummated. History, and nothing but time travel could restore it. And then my thoughts returned to my little starlet. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when I entered the house, trying to keep as quiet as possible. To my great surprise, instead of sleeping soundly, Stella was lying on the bed. She said, "I knew you would need comforting after talking to your buddy." What the hell kind of female compassion is that? First Brenda, now her. Are all women whores? Feeling her touch on my consciousness, I recoiled, jumping to my feet. Gasping, she quickly threw on one of the hotel's fluffy white robes. She looked terrible. The robe was 3 or 4 sizes too big for her, making her look like a 6-year-old girl. Her perfect face went from alabaster to fiery red. She gasped, "I'm so sorry, I saw it. It was faded. I had no idea." I angrily replied, "What did I see?" Her little charade was starting to get annoying. Or maybe I was just sick of other people, especially women. She said simply, "How inappropriate my actions were. You're in conflict. You don't want to part with your mate, but you don't understand how you can be with her." I looked stunned. Could she really be a mind reader? She added sympathetically, "She's not really an obstacle. You know she only wants you. It is the disrespect, the deliberate attempt to deceive you that seems intractable to you. You don't know how you will be able to maintain your dignity if you ignore the lack of respect she has shown you by entering into a secret relationship." Okay, I didn't know how she did it, but that was the problem. It was a matter of preserving my pride. Pride is the deadliest sin because it is directly related to who you are. Lust, greed, gluttony, sloth, envy, anger are direct transgressions. You can overcome them by suppressing desire. But pride is innate. Pride dictates how you perceive yourself and how you behave. If you have too much pride, you're a vain asshole. If you have too little, you are a weakling. The problem is that the mindset required to maintain an acceptable balance has to be constantly adjusted with each new challenge. Otherwise, you sacrifice your self-esteem. I could have beaten Brenda Tadwell if she had managed to convince me that she had learned her lesson. The real trauma was that she had knowingly conspired to share herself with a guy I hated. This violation required an appropriate response, or I would lose all sense of self-worth and dignity. For me, the only acceptable response to willful betrayal was the dissolution of the marriage. Of course, Brenda had her own excuses. On the surface, they may seem convincing. But what do you say to someone who decides to cheat and then lies about it? What could Brenda say to me that would convince me that she wouldn't do it again? It was a real existential dilemma. Sartre would have been pleased. Stella was clearly watching my thoughts as these feelings raced through my head. And yes, I was beginning to believe she could do it. Her beautiful face reflected my emotions as I worked through the situation. She eagerly said, "I will be your companion. We are both single right now." It remained to be resolved, but it was getting late and I had a busy day ahead of me. I asked, "Do you mind if we sleep now?" She nodded and replied, "Our sleep cycles are not like yours, but I need to shut off my mind and the darkness helps me do that." That was interesting. Is she really a robot? I turned off the light because I didn't want to think about it. Brenda met me at the door. She looked awful. Polly had called me a whore last night. Apparently she saw the video that Tude sent out to the world. I haven't seen it since I'm not on his contact list. I looked skeptical. She replied embarrassed. He deleted me from his phone when we started dating. He said he wanted to avoid suspicion. I thought, what an idiot. Brenda said, "I saw the clip and all the incriminating text messages. By the way, thank you for exposing me. I don't know how I will be able to look my friends in the eye after witnessing these dirty deeds." She sadly added, "I don't know why Richard sent these things out, but he has ruined his life. Polly is divorcing him, and the BBC is launching an investigation. Adultery is a crime in the army, you know that." Then she realized what else she was implying and added hastily, "I haven't spoken to Richard since my world came crashing down. Polly told me all of this." I could have warned Brenda that Turd's current problems were just the tip of the iceberg. I had far more diabolical thoughts about how his life would turn out when I got to the dark web. But that would remain between me and Turd. My current goal was to find an acceptable way out of the marriage. As we had every morning for the past 14 years, we sat at the kitchen table and sipped a delicious French roast. I'm sure I looked as stunned as she did. Her eyes were puffy and red from crying. Her hair was disheveled, and she looked like she hadn't gotten a good night's sleep. People react to betrayal in different ways. Those who react to betrayal more impulsively lose control of themselves. They whine, scream, throw things, and engage in self-destructive behavior. This happens because they are frustrated with their inability to change the injustice of their circumstances. I suppose it's great if you're the same way. Tantrums may even be enjoyable in the moment, but it's self-destructive. You gain nothing but more rage and frustration. And shit happens. The key to preserving your personal pride lies in how you react. Brenda and I had a tough attitude. It was part of our attraction. We were practical people. We always managed to accept the things we couldn't change, and we had the wisdom to know the difference. We also understood that circumstances were what they were. We were now determined to deal with them as civilized as we could. We had had 14 good years. None of us wanted to mar those happy times, so there would be no melodrama. Just two people who once loved each other, dealing with an unimaginable tragedy in the most constructive way possible. She looked at me seriously, searching for a modicum of hope. I stared back with inevitability. At last she said pitifully, "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded. She continued, "I knew it as soon as I saw the video clip. I swear he meant nothing to me, and that makes what I did even more incomprehensible." I continued to just stare at her, shocked. She sighed and said with an ironic chuckle, "It's for the best. I probably wouldn't respect you if you wanted to stay married." Brenda was a very tough and pragmatic woman. I said, "It wasn't about sex, it was bad enough, but the infidelity was the deciding factor." Then I paused. I couldn't hold back any longer. I said with deep sadness, "Why did you conspire with that miserable asshole to cheat on me?" Her face turned white. She lowered her head and sobbed, the wings of her hair hiding her face. I waited. Finally, she pulled herself together, wiped her eyes, and said with strain in her voice, "When do you think I fell?" The question caught me off guard. I shrugged and asked, confused, "Why does it matter?" She replied, "Because it proves what a stupid woman I am." She paused and gathered her thoughts. Then she said, "Up to the time we quarreled over Richard, I hadn't done anything that didn't attract my husband's undivided attention. Perhaps he was giving me signs. But I was too stupid to see them, so I thought your concerns were misplaced and foolish. The next time he came, I told Richard what you had told me, and he assured me he would not look in again. That's when it all happened. I thought the situation was resolved, and I was going to walk him to the door. But first I took our coffee cups to the sink. He came up behind me, grabbed me, and kissed me aggressively. I wasn't expecting this. I was confused and lost in that moment. She made a sheepish look and said, "You know what that kind of touching does to me? I've turned into a crazy person." Brenda saw my distress and added softly, "It has nothing to do with the man. It's all about the situation, the fact that things were very messed up." She added sadly, "And then there was accounting. I consider myself a moral person. I didn't want to do it at first, really." Brenda smiled grimly and replied, "My ego couldn't handle the truth, because otherwise I'd just be a slut and wouldn't have gone willingly." I refrained from commenting. "The truth? Are you asking me if I believed her?" The answer is totally. A normal person would have made a mental note and moved on. But a sociopath like Turd would have taken Brenda's hotness as an opportunity, and certainly as his right. When Sir Edmund Hillary was asked why he climbed Mount Everest, he replied, "Because he had to." It was the same with Brenda. She was there. And Turd had to take the challenge, so to speak. Why did he do such a heinous act? Because he could. It was part and parcel of his need to prove, or perhaps more correctly, assure himself that he is as strong and powerful as he believes himself to be. It is the hallmark of a true narcissist, someone who has no idea that other people have feelings. Brenda made a grimace and said, "Never underestimate the power of guilt in a good Catholic girl. My promiscuous behavior was killing me, so I desperately needed a way to forgive myself." Then she hesitantly added, and it was obvious I wasn't going to like this part. And then Richard let a tear fall. He told me how much I meant to him, how I had saved his life. So this was my convenient absolution. I saved a sweet, sensitive, and misunderstood soul from a bad situation. Brenda wrinkled her nose and said, I won't lie. It was amazing. It was so unusual, so excitingly forbidden. I knew it was wrong, but I justified myself with the fact that you'll never know. So it wouldn't hurt you. It was a sad delusion. But what was I supposed to do? Her voice dropped to a whisper. She said guiltily, the seal was broken. I was the deceiver. So yes, I met him 3 more times. It was the same as the last time. I would fly in, and we would meet at the hotel. She realized how much she had upset me. She took my hand in both of hers, searched my face with her eyes, and said, I was 2 people. A big part of me was your devoted wife. I have not lost an inch of my love and respect for you. She concluded by saying, oddly enough, I just told him it was the last time. He said he wanted me to remember me one more time and I was already in the room. And I thought, why not? It's pathetic. She paused and said, that's my story. I know you and I realize the consequences. I take full responsibility for my actions and will sign any agreement you offer me. I will do this because I love you and I know it's the right thing to do. I finally realized that. You can admire an opponent after a tough fight. That's exactly how I felt about my soon-to-be ex-wife. In one of her incarnations, Brenda might have been a cheating whore. But right now, the woman I loved was running things. After all, this woman was closing the books with a bang. I hugged her as I left. I said, I'll contact Jim Eastman. He was our family lawyer. Since the divorce will be relatively amicable, he will be able to represent both of us. I added, and then I'll disappear for a while. I need to lick my wounds, and I want to do it in a private place. I'll have to coordinate that with Sandia. But they owe me an unpayable debt, so I don't think they'll mind. She put her hand on my cheek, looked sadly into my eyes, and said, I understand and I'm sorry. I'll be here if you change your mind. Closing the door, she cried. I reached the nearest park and threw up. Now there was only a barren landscape in front of me. It was horrible. It's funny how people's moral stance changes depending on the circumstances. I was divorcing Brenda because she was hiding something from me. At the same time, I was cohabitating with a woman who was far more beautiful than even my gorgeous wife. And Brenda didn't realize it. So who's the liar now? No, of course, I couldn't tell Brenda that this particular woman was with me because she was from another planet. And by the way, did I mention she's telepathic? They would have locked me in a rubber room. I was also sure that Brenda would have a hard time accepting any assurances that our relationship was purely platonic, especially after meeting Stella. Thus, even though I had temporarily cleared the deck in one area, an even stranger problem awaited me on the way out. When I returned, Stella was still in her robe. She was staring mesmerized at the TV, which was showing an episode of Friends. She excitedly said, I'm studying the culture of Earth. I highly doubted that Chandler, Ross, Joey, Monica, or Rachel belonged to any culture outside of TV land. But I asked, did you guys eat anything? She cheerfully replied, yes, I ate my daily waffle and pointed to the thing on my wrist. Nah. She pulled one of the waffles out of her wrist device and showed it to me. It was a half-inch cube. All I could think of was Soylent Green. I asked, would you like anything else? She replied satisfactorily, no, this has everything I need for the next 24 hours. I asked, and you live on this? She replied, of course, it's a complete diet. I asked, does it taste good? I ordered room service food. She looked at me puzzled and replied, why? Is it supposed to taste good? A thought struck me. She really is convincingly portraying someone who has never lived on Earth. Except I didn't believe it. It was too corny. I asked, how old are you? She replied absent-mindedly, still watching the antics of the oddball gang at Central Perk. 277 on my next birthday. She looked 26. I whistled and said jokingly, you're holding up pretty good for an old girl. She replied angrily, what do you mean old? I've only lived a quarter of my normal life. I didn't argue with this crazy woman. Instead, I said, we'll have to buy you some clothes. You can't walk around in what you came to Earth in. She insultingly replied, What's wrong with my suit? It's the latest in permer hick on cough. I nodded toward the screen and said, you're going to have to look more like these women if you want to fit in. Otherwise, people might start thinking you're not from around here. A waggle of eyebrows and a wink conveyed the concept of alien autopsy. She looked at him in horror and said, how can I wear anything else? This is all I have. I was visited by inspiration. I said, your current outfit wouldn't look out of place at Walmart. We can buy you clothes there. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and the room service guy rolled in a tray of bagels and lox. I tried to tip him, but he couldn't take his eyes off Stella. As he left, he banged on the door. I spread cream cheese on the bagel and said, try this. It's what we eat here. She took a bite. Her eyes rolled and she shuddered with her whole body. Gasping, she said, is that what it tastes like? An hour later, we walked into the Walmart Supercenter supermarket on San Mateo. Stella kept bumping into the display cases and looking around mesmerized. As mesmerized, she said, look at all these beautiful things. I've never heard anyone talk about Walmart merchandise like that. The Chinese would be honored. Brenda spent 2 hours at the racks of clothes in the back of the store and another 40 minutes in the cosmetics department. She said seriously, I learned about all of this from the Home Shopping Network. I really wanted to cut Stella out of my life. She was making life very difficult, and her alien behavior made it hard to focus on the housework I was supposed to be doing. It was like babysitting a 5-year-old child. But unlike a baby, Stella literally stopped traffic everywhere she went. I was especially concerned about not being seen with her in public. At least not until things were back to normal. My soon-to-be ex-wife didn't deserve such a revelation. Yeah, I knew it was Brenda's fault, but tough guys don't party in the end zone after a touchdown. It's just not classy. I could have told Brenda about Stella, but what good would that do? It's not like I cheated on my soon-to-be ex-wife. We were already divorced. So when we got back to the room, I said, tonight I want to take you out to dinner. It's going to be just like us Earthlings. We'll dress up and spend the evening talking. You've seen it on TV, right? She nodded readily. I asked, would you like to do that? My star girl got very excited. Apparently, she had seen something similar on Real Housewives and wanted to try it. She also wanted to continue her tasting experiment. I said, I have some personal preparations to make. I'll be back around 6 o'clock to pick you up. There was no way I wanted to talk about Stella's future as we sat in the room. I spent the day making plans for the divorce. It would be an easy divorce since everything was amicable. Easy if you ignored the heartache that would follow. Part of me still wondered why I was doing this. Until the ghost of Richard Tadwell showed up and said, yeah, why do it, man? She's so cool. Thanks, Tad. That was exactly the reminder I needed. I also arranged to take a vacation for a couple of weeks. My team could do without me, and the bureaucrats didn't care what I did as long as I covered their asses. I needed to help Stella. Whether that help would be psychological or astrophysical remained to be seen. Stella was ready when I got back. She was breathtaking. But I just stood there with my mouth open. She, for her part, looked absolutely terrified. She must have used a source like YouTube to learn how to apply makeup. Up until that point, she hadn't worn any makeup at all. The enhancement had elevated her extraterrestrial beauty to intergalactic class. We were just coming down the stairs to a restaurant that couldn't be called 5-star. But there was no way we could get into one of the high-end establishments without noticing Stella. She might even attract the attention of the paparazzi. A woman that beautiful should be famous, right? The last thing I wanted was for Brenda to think I was waiting for a replacement. And not because I was trying not to be vindictive. It was just that I knew our divorce would go down a much less constructive path if Brenda thought I was replacing her. Stella asked worriedly, do I look good? Is this what you expected? That was probably the biggest understatement since we have a problem with Houston. I wondered if the gene for insecurity was inherent in the X chromosome. My only concern was how to fend off predators with a stick. Once we were seated, I ordered food for both of us. I was careful to make sure everything was tasteless, as Stella claimed to have lived her entire life on what appeared to be fish food. She insisted on trying everything I ordered. Every now and then, she would throw speculative glances at me. She knew what we were here for. Remember, she's supposedly a mind reader. Finally, I said, okay, so how do we get you back to your world? She stopped mid-bite and looked unhappy. She asked, "What makes you think I want to go back?" I replied, "Don't you have family or a special person you'd like to go back to?" I know that sounded crazy, but it was so much easier to act like she had just flown in from outer space. She became pensive, as if mulling over her answer. She said carefully, "I've never had a family. They don't raise children that way on Kashla. And there's nothing to go back to anyway. They're probably all packed up by now, grunting, growing, hissing." Then she hesitated and added timidly, "Maybe you are my special someone. Have you ever thought about that?" I said incredulously, "How can you even say that? We've known each other for exactly 24 hours." She rubbed her head and replied, "I know everything about you. You have everything I value in a partner. You're kind, decent, smart, funny, and adventurous. I know your current girlfriend made a huge mistake by acting the way she did. I would never make that mistake." And then it hit me. Perhaps this was opening a path forward. But first, I needed to confirm something. I looked intently at Stella, trying to read her face, and said, "When I went to bed last night, you said you needed to shut off your thoughts. What did you mean by that?" I knew the question came out of the blue. I thought it was. Let's see what she said to that question. She laughed and immediately replied, "Our race has always interacted telepathically. We may have communicated by voice in the past as well, but our planet is much older than yours." She added carelessly, "Our telepathic receptors are omnidirectional. It's like human hearing, so there is always background noise. We shield our minds to be polite. People on your planet don't do that, so I have to filter it out, and it's exhausting. It helps me if I can turn off my sensors. It's like your need for sleep." Oh my God, that was too detailed an explanation to come up with. I asked, stunned, "So what you told me is true? You're actually an alien? Yet you remain just a woman?" That's like saying that an SR-71 Blackbird is just an airplane, but I still couldn't accept that the radiant beauty sitting across from me was real. She smiled affectionately at me and replied, "Of course it is. The universe is populated by countless humanoid civilizations. We are all biologically similar. As I said, this is the most efficient configuration." I added, still stunned, "Really? White Sands has a portal to a million other worlds, and you're actually a refugee from another planet?" She said conversationally, as if we were discussing bus stops. "Well, there is another portal in the Jura Mountains right now. It's located near a place called CERN. It was built when your race started experimenting with subatomic particles. I believe it is called the Large Hadron Collider. It's another great achievement." Wow. First I found out my wife was having fun with another guy. Now I found out I was talking to a real alien. And it wasn't an ugly little creature with Einstein's eyes. Man, Spielberg was always wrong. Stella smiled radiantly and said, "Now you believe me." I replied, a little stunned, "I believe you." She said impatiently, "So I can become your companion? I am even willing to undergo the initiation ceremony. It will bind us for life." I said, still trembling a little, "Let's take it one step at a time. It's not like we're using a killer device to make sure we stay together." She looked puzzled, as if she couldn't figure out how we could do otherwise. I smiled affectionately, and for the first time, I felt love rather than annoyance. She really was a sweet, modest, and simple woman, and I had the feeling that underneath all those alien oddities lurked an unusually pure soul. I said softly, "We need to learn to be bonded, and I am still legally bound to another woman. That has to be officially undone before we can be committed to each other." Well, if I was going to bond with this beautiful alien woman, I might as well start speaking her language. The jump was unexpected, but you know how it is. I had felt a natural attraction to Stella, almost from the moment I discovered her in the desert. She was a perfect woman in the physical sense, a beautiful movie star. But what attracted me most was her good-natured and happy-go-lucky demeanor. There wasn't a single evil or conniving bone in her body. I spent some time looking for a place where we could live. I wanted to find a safe place not too far from the city where Stella could begin to get used to Earth and Earth customs. We spent the 2 weeks I'd taken on vacation settling in while I paid the ridiculous bills at the Marriott. I felt like I needed to hide Stella. I know that sounds hypocritical. After all, it was Brenda's secret affairs that ruined our marriage. But I was hiding my star girl for another reason. What's more, My marriage was already over. It just hadn't been officially dissolved, and I wanted the process to be amicable. Many divorces end in bitterness and animosity. Things get messy, people get beaten up, and they suffer emotionally. But this process can go without bitterness and chaos. Brenda and I had enough dignity to interact in a civilized manner. Or maybe we just stuck to the old maxim, never let them see you sweat. Either way, neither of us gave the appearance of being offended. Instead, we discussed the situation until the very end, which, while not ideal, suited us both. It was during one of these discussions that the topic of other people came up. Moving on to others was a simple conclusion. We were both reasonably attractive and heterosexual, so there would inevitably come a point where we would begin to move down that path. Brenda said with embarrassment, "Davy, I want to talk about what we should do next. I've been asked out by a lot of men since we broke up, and I want your permission to start dating again." It wasn't as patronizing as it sounded. Obviously, we would both find other men to date. Brenda was beautiful, and of course I had already met my one and only. So I was glad and pleased that she had shown me enough respect to make the first move. I smiled and said, "You have been a wonderful wife, and I know you will be one for the next lucky man as well. You are a stunningly attractive woman, and it would be criminal to hide your light under a bushel. So we both need to begin the process of distancing ourselves from each other." She looked at me sadly. The expression on her face said, "I wish we were living together instead of apart." I added softly, "We both need a fresh start." I believed that. Once the bond is broken, there's no going back, no matter how much you want to. And if you do go back, it will always be an imperfect compromise with the past. Stella gave me hope for a brighter future. I wanted Brenda to have the same hope. Besides, I was beginning to recognize my star girl. Stella might have come from a wormhole in the center of the galaxy, but in personality, it was like she'd flown into town on a bus from Nebraska. She was simple, happy, and cordial, not an implacable alien. Although I had to warn her from time to keep her out of my head. She was constantly tiptoeing around like a faithful golden retriever, checking in, wanting to reassure me. I rented a house in Sandia Heights, which was a quick drive to the National Laboratory on Highway 556. The neighborhood was upscale, but with a rural bias. Stella had plenty of room to spread out without worrying about close neighbors. The guy I was renting from wanted to sell the apartment, so we made a deal. Once the divorce was finalized, I would buy it for the price he offered. In the meantime, it was off the market. The purchase was only a month and a half later. Helping Stella set up my world more than made up for all the regrets of losing Brenda. Stella's world was a preview of Earth's future. It was catastrophically overpopulated and polluted to the point where trillions of its inhabitants were forced to exist inside polymer domes. Their society was therefore highly regulated and limited. Each person was assigned a specific role at birth and lived their lives following all the prescriptions. Stella herself was a console operator in a transportation center, so she knew about one little thing that was completely out of place in my world. Think of cell phones. They are ubiquitous. Everyone uses them. But few of us understand how the electronics of a cell phone or cellular network work, or can create one. This is exactly the situation Stella found herself in. She did not belong to those who create and control or direct the technology. She was a simple technician. Now let's move to the 18th century. In those days, knowing how to use a cell phone wouldn't have done you any good. At the same time, everyone around you knew how to cope with life better than you did. This was exactly the kind of problem Stella faced. Even though she had experience with a world that was many light years more advanced, she needed to learn how to live here. She spent hours on the internet. The same general concept existed on her world, but access to it was implanted in the human mind, so all they needed was a thought. Now Stella had to navigate social media and the other garbage of life on the internet. Worse, she had to do it on a device that she thought was a notch above a stone tablet. As Stella learned to speak, dress, and act like a normal Earthwoman, I began taking her places like a normal couple. One night we had dinner at Antiquity Restaurant, which is near Albuquerque's historic plaza. It serves the best Chateaubriand in town. Brenda and I have dined there often in the past. No guy would feel completely safe appearing in public with a woman like Stella. She creates a sensation everywhere she appears. Necks craning, people gawking like the people of the African veldt at the appearance of a lion. And yet I wasn't afraid of losing her because she never seemed to notice other people. It was like I was glued to her like a little duckling. Today, she was wearing a classic black dress with a simple string of pearls. She had such perfect facial features that looking at her was like looking at a work of art. We were sharing a plate of carpaccio, and Stella was so enamored with the little bits of beef that she cooed and purred in my head. At that moment, a gregarious voice called out, "Hi, Davy. I knew I'd run into you sooner or later." I had heard that voice for 14 years now, so without looking up, I cheerfully replied, "Brenda, good to see you." She was standing next to our table with a guy who was obviously her date. She was cheerful as always. I rose from my seat and said by way of introduction, "Stella, this is my ex-wife Brenda." Stella looked up and replied, "It's nice to finally meet you, Brenda. Davy has only good things to say about you." It was brutal. The full force of Stella's beauty made both Brenda and her companion blink. It was like the reaction when stepping out of the shadows into bright sunlight. Brenda said embarrassedly, "This is my fiancé, Tom." We shook hands. I knew who Tom Holland was. He was the largest real estate developer in the entire Middle Rio Grande Basin and was rumored to be the Senate candidate for the People's Militia Party. The two of us undoubtedly switched places. I said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Tom, and I wish you both nothing but happiness." This was followed by the typical smiling rejection that people display when they can't get out of a situation quickly. I sat down, and the two of them headed to their table. Holland cast one last disbelieving glance back. Stella said nonchalantly, "She still regrets losing you, and that man has a very dirty mind." Meeting Brenda was a mere coincidence. We were at Antiquity for a different reason. I looked into Stella's incredible emerald eyes and said, "I told you we have a commitment ceremony where two people bond in marriage." She replied, "Yes, but there is no implant there to guarantee fidelity." I said, "But we do have a sign that a woman wears as a token of her fidelity." I had learned to hide my thoughts a bit, so when I pulled out the ring it was a surprise, and I said, "We can only promise to be faithful, but I will die before I betray him." An explosion of pure, unrequited love almost knocked me out of the stall. That night was the first time we made love. I was nervous. It was the kind of anxiety one feels when engaging in one last, intimate relationship with the most important woman in your life. I asked, "How do you begin to make love in your world?" She replied, "There is no ritual." We connected a month after the divorce. Stella didn't want to use the term married. She said it didn't reflect her feelings for me. To her, we were just relatives. That would have been the case even if Stella's relatives didn't live on the other side of the galaxy. It was just the way we were. Stella insisted on the Invidian bond. That's how her homeworld was labeled in my mind. I realized why she wanted to do it that way as we went through the ceremony. We had decided to have it in a special place, so our wedding night was held in the REI Half Dome tent. We were sitting on a rock ledge in the Face Shield, a huge cliff behind Albuquerque in the Sandia Mountains. The sun was setting over the purple expanse of desert landscape. The lights of the city began to flicker in the encroaching darkness below us. Stella was enthralled. Perhaps her planet was more advanced, but it had to pay for it with catastrophic overpopulation and environmental destruction. Life there was bleak. My world was a land of new experiences, and Stella delighted in every discovery she made. My bride was dressed in rough hiking gear, not a long white dress. We hiked up knife-edge rock on a trail that only experienced hikers and rock climbers can do. Stella managed it better than most of the regulars. One of Stella's quirks was that she was easily able to handle any physical challenge. I was beginning to realize that, in addition to reading minds, my new wife had powers beyond the world. We dangled our legs over the edge. The July evening was soft and fragrant. Stella told me to lie down on a rock. She lay down beside me, holding my hand. The sky darkened to shades of purple and red, the moon rose, and the first stars began to appear. Stella pointed to the Pleiades cluster and said quietly, "Concentrate on it." I followed her finger to the familiar cluster of stars. As I did so, I felt her stand on tiptoe and enter my mind. She set up a tiny mental beacon that transmitted a clear and steady signal of caring love. A powerful subconscious connection had been established between us. Finishing, she said with a blessing, "This will remain between us forever. We are now connected to each other." And so we were married. It wasn't in the conventional sense, but it was as deep and real and permanent as any ceremony ever performed in the presence of a priest. Life went on in the same way for nearly a year. It was an endless series of adventures and simple pleasures. I had never been so happy. But of course the gods liked to mess with me. So I came home from work on a beautiful fall day in the desert. The sun was shining and the temperature was over 70. Soccer season was starting, and I was wondering how the Lobos would perform in the Mountain West this season. I walked out of the garage whistling a cheerful tune, and then my wife appeared. She was standing in our kitchen with the most handsome man I'd ever seen. In movies, on TV, on the cover of GQ. He was wearing the same outfit Stella wore when I first saw her. Stella looked glum. She said, "Davy, we need to talk." Those fateful words are usually the prelude to a grand heartbreak, but I could feel my little beacon giving a clear, sure signal. Nothing had happened to disrupt our connection, yet, and yet my blood pressure spiked to heart attack because of the look on Stella's face. She said meekly, "That's Kalel. He's grumpy, grouchy, and grumpy. He's come to take me to Nvidia." The thought of a bounty hunter crossed my mind. I shouted, "Where to?" I knew exactly what she was talking about. It was just a reflex reaction. Not only was Kalel as handsome as a Greek god, but he was also slender. I wondered if there was a single person on the planet Stella who didn't possess unearthly perfection. He grinned contemptuously and said, as if talking to a pet, "We've been looking for Stella ever since she jumped through the portal. Now that we've found her, I'm here to bring her back." I said, "That's crazy. She loves me. Why would she go with you?" The guy just stared at me like he couldn't believe he was arguing with such an inferior being. Finally, he said, "She has no right to be here. She can alert your authorities to our presence." Then he made a sound of annoyance, turned away, and said, "I'm not here to discuss this with you, Earthling. Come on, Stella. The portal will be open for a few more minutes." Stella angrily replied, "I told you I'm not going back. I have my own life here with the man I'm devoted to. Nothing you say or do will make me leave him." Mr. Eat said contemptuously, "You cannot be committed to a lower form of life. It is not lawful. Either you come with me, or I will take you by force." With those words, he grabbed Stella by one of her arms and began dragging her out the door. Apparently, the guy had some kind of UFO parked in our backyard. Stella tried to wrench her arm free. I had to do something about it. There was no way I was going to win a physical fight with this guy. "But that's not how I do things," I said carelessly. "I know you're an alien superintelligence and all that, buddy, but you'll notice that everything you've done since you walked in here has been recorded." I pointed to the tiny surveillance camera in the corner of the ceiling and said, "If you're kidnapping Stella because your Nvidian masters don't want her to reveal the presence of your race, how do you think they will react when they find you proving the existence of extraterrestrial life through TMZ and Fox News?" I laughed, trying to sound more confident than I actually felt, and added, "We have this thing called the internet. It is beyond your comprehension. But I can assure you that you will become a worldwide viral sensation if you don't get in your flying saucer and fly back to where you came from." Mr. Eat stopped and looked into the camera. He looked puzzled. Apparently superintelligences aren't that observant. Or maybe he underestimated us Earthlings. I knew exactly what he was thinking. I said informatively, "You're finished. There's nothing here that can be erased. You'll never find the recording. It's being streamed to a cloud account. So smile." The alien dropped Stella's hand and turned to me. He said, "You won't be able to report it if you vaporize." At that moment, he pulled out something that looked like a fountain pen. I didn't seriously think he was going to write me a check. I wasn't scared. I was encouraged. I thought, at least I'll die protecting the woman I love. Then I heard a resounding gong. The light went out in Mr. E.T.'s eyes and he staggered backwards as if his strings had been severed. Stella stood behind him, stretched out to her full height like Serena Williams doing a forehand shot on center court. In both hands, she held an old-fashioned cast-iron skillet. It was a very effective low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. The little beacon in my head flashed brightly. It was Stella, soaring with joy. She said, "I was always afraid someone would come after me. I think we're safe at last." Of course, this presented us with a new problem. We had to get rid of the body. There are a lot of ghost towns around Albuquerque. The closest one was called Golden. In the 19th century, Golden was the center of gold mining in all of Albuquerque, hence the name. There was a Catholic church, saloons, businesses, a school, and even a stock exchange. But the gold ran out at the end of the century, and by the 1920s, Golden had become a ghost town. Their old cemetery is next to a restored church built in 1830. Stella and I drove 30 miles from our house with Kalele strapped in the back like Weekend at Bernie's. The area was completely deserted, just as we expected. I parked and left the headlights on. We dragged the body through the brittle desert shrubbery to an area of old graves. I knew of the urban legends I'd gathered from burying an alien in a ghost town. The ground was mostly sandy, so digging was easy. Not that they had the dude's fingerprints. He'll remain a mysterious unknown. If, of course, he's ever found. We put him in the hole and covered him up. Then we went back to the truck. It was already 10 o'clock when we finished our gruesome task. I sank into the chair by the fireplace. Stella sat serenely in her usual pose on the couch. I asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" After all, she had just killed a man. She looked at me calmly and replied, "There's nothing to talk about. I could never leave you." So I did what I had to do. I started digging further. Why? Maybe because I'm an insecure wimp. But on the other hand, Stella had just killed a man. I asked, "How do you feel?" "Okay, Snowflake. Enough." She replied simply, "You're the person I'm loyal to, and Kalel was going to turn you into a cloud of composite particles. I couldn't let that happen. I promised to be your life's companion, to support you in everything. I did." And in that simple statement was encapsulated all that mattered. Married people care about each other. That's invariable, no matter what planet you come from. This beautiful woman may have come out of a wormhole from another arm of the galaxy. But she understood love and loyalty. As time went on, we grew older. Stella was fascinated by aging. She told me that the causes of aging are well understood, and if there is knowledge, it can be controlled. On Earth, we call it epigenetics. We've even started doing serious research on telomeres and manipulating genes, but the people on Stella's world perfected this process centuries ago. It was like going to a tanning salon. Every inhabitant went through a life cycle procedure. You lay down in a special device. It would scan you and remove any defects. After that, you could move on to the next cycle. Since these cycles were similar to Earth's lifespan, the inhabitants of Stella's world lived very long lives and were always in good health. Right now, we were both feeling the weight of the happy years we had spent together. Stella's transcendent beauty prevented her from being classically corrupted by the effects of time. In fact, she was beautiful at any age. I just got older. My commitment to fitness allowed me to stay relatively healthy. But there was no escaping the dreaded diagnosis. It was draining my vitality, and Stella was distraught. When the situation became unbearable, my wife loaded me into our truck and we headed south. When she parked in the spot where we first met, a stunning starry desert sky opened up above us. We then began the harrowing trek through the Jornada del Muerto to the obelisk. 4 miles is a long way for a nearly dead man, and it took several hours. Stella supported me every step of the way, putting her hand on my shoulder like a warrior wounded by life. The 12-foot-tall monument stood black against the star-studded sky. The desert was silent. A light wind blew from the west. I was sweating and panting from the effort. Stella let go of my hand and leaned me lovingly against the black lava of the obelisk. She was wearing the suit and armband she had worn when we first met. She walked a few yards past the obelisk and did something with the device. The air began to shimmer, and the stars in that part of the sky disappeared, replaced by a miniature galaxy. She came back to me, threw my arm over her shoulder, and helped me into a chair. She said, "We will make you well again, my love." Epilogue. It was deep night at the Trinity site. It was dark and lonely all around, as it can only be in the desert. Then a shimmer appeared, growing into a blurry shape like a galactic wheel. The shimmer parted like a curtain and 2 people walked through it. Then it disappeared. The man was trim and young-looking. The woman was a splendid specimen of femininity. For several long minutes they stood together, gazing longingly into the night sky. Then they turned and walked hand in hand down the path toward the distant road. She asked in the dubious tone of a long-married wife, "Are you sure the truck will start, honey?" He replied in the voice of the archetypally patient husband. Of course it will start, my love. It's only been a day. Now let's have breakfast. We have our whole life ahead of us. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.